The sound of my body hitting each wooden step still echoes in my mind 15 years later. But what my mother never knew was that our old baby monitor, the one she thought was broken, caught every single moment, every push, every lie, every whispered threat from my brother Marcus, and most importantly, her response when I crawled back upstairs with a bleeding lip and bruised ribs, begging her to believe me. "Don't tell anyone, Alina. You probably just fell. You know how clumsy you are." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But I had proof, and last week I finally used it. The autumn light filtered through the dusty windows of our old Victorian house on Maple Street, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that I had grown to fear. I was 12 years old, and my brother Marcus was 15, towering over me with the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing you're untouchable. He had always been the golden child, the one who could charm his way out of anything, while I remained perpetually in his shadow, trying desperately to earn even a fraction of the attention he received without effort. That particular October afternoon, I remember the house smelled like cinnamon and apples. Mom had been baking for the church fundraiser, one of her many community activities that kept her busy and distracted from what was really happening under her own roof. She had this way of seeing only what she wanted to see, and what she wanted to see was her perfect son Marcus, the star of the soccer team, the boy who never met a teacher he couldn't win over with his easy smile and quick wit. I was coming up the stairs from the basement, my arms full of Halloween decorations that Mom had asked me to retrieve. My backpack was heavy with homework, and I was already dreading the math test I had the next day. Math had never been my strong suit, unlike Marcus, who seemed to excel at everything without even trying. As I reached the halfway point on the staircase, I saw him waiting for me at the top, leaning against the banister with that smirk I had learned to recognize as trouble. The baby monitor sat on the small table at the top of the stairs, a relic from when I was younger. Mom thought it was broken because the receiver in her room only produced static, but I had discovered that the transmitter still worked perfectly. It had become my secret companion, something I would whisper my fears and dreams to late at night when the house was quiet and I felt most alone. What I didn't realize was that it was still transmitting to the old receiver we kept in the basement storage room, the one Dad used to use when he worked on his woodworking projects before the divorce. Marcus looked down at me with those cold blue eyes, so different from the warm, laughing ones he showed to everyone else. "Well, well, well, if it isn't our little princess, carrying Mommy's precious decorations." His voice carried that mocking tone I knew all too well, the one that meant I was about to become his entertainment for the afternoon. I tried to squeeze past him, keeping my eyes down, hoping that if I didn't engage, he might lose interest and find something else to do. But Marcus was like a predator who could sense fear, and my fear only seemed to fuel his cruelty. He stepped directly into my path, blocking my way to the top of the stairs. "Where do you think you're going, Elena? Don't you want to play with your big brother?" His smile was sharp and mean, and I felt my stomach twist with the familiar dread that came whenever he used that particular tone. I clutched the decorations tighter to my chest. "Mom's waiting for these. She needs them for the church thing." My voice came out smaller than I intended, barely above a whisper. Marcus laughed, and it was a sound devoid of any real humor. "Mom's always waiting for something from you, isn't she? Too bad you're always such a disappointment." He reached out and grabbed one of the paper pumpkins from my arms, holding it just out of my reach when I tried to get it back. "Give it back, Marcus, please." I could hear the pleading in my own voice and hated myself for it, but I also knew that begging sometimes worked. Sometimes, if I made myself small enough, pathetic enough, he would get bored and move on to something else. Instead, he tore the pumpkin in half, letting the pieces flutter down the stairs like orange snow. "Oops, looks like you'll have to tell Mom you broke it. You know how clumsy you are, Alina, always dropping things, always messing up." That's when I made the mistake of standing up for myself. "I'm not clumsy. You tore it on purpose, and you know it." The words came out before I could stop them, fueled by years of accumulated frustration and injustice. Marcus's expression darkened instantly, and I saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. "What did you just say to me?" I should have apologized. I should have backed down, made myself small again, and waited for the storm to pass. But something in me had finally reached its breaking point, and instead of retreating, I found myself taking a step forward. I said, "You tore it on purpose, and I'm tired of you blaming me for the things you do." My voice was stronger now, fueled by a courage I didn't know I possessed. For a moment, Marcus just stared at me, and I thought maybe I had finally gotten through to him, that maybe this would be the moment he realized how cruel he had been. But then his hand shot out, and before I could react, he shoved me hard in the chest. Time seemed to slow as I felt my balance give way. The decorations scattered from my arms like confetti, and I reached desperately for the banister, but my fingers only brushed against the smooth wood before I was falling backward down the stairs. Each impact was an explosion of pain. My shoulder hit the third step, sending shooting agony down my arm. My hip caught the fifth step with a crack that I felt more than heard. My head bounced off the seventh step, and suddenly the world was spinning, filled with flashes of light and the taste of copper in my mouth. When I finally came to rest at the bottom of the stairs, everything was quiet except for the ringing in my ears and the sound of my own ragged breathing. Above me, I could hear Marcus's voice, but it sounded different now, panicked and high-pitched. "Elena? Elena, get up! Come on, don't be dramatic, it wasn't that bad." I tried to move, but everything hurt. My lip was bleeding, and I could feel it swelling already. My ribs ached with every breath, and when I tried to sit up, the room spun violently, forcing me to lie back down. That's when I heard Mom's voice, sharp with concern as she came running from the kitchen. What happened? What was that noise? I heard Marcus's footsteps as he bounded down the stairs, and when he spoke, his voice had transformed completely. Gone was the cruel mockery, replaced by the worried, caring tone of the perfect big brother. "I don't know, Mom."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I was in my room doing homework, and I heard this crash. I think Elena fell down the stairs. Through the haze of pain, I felt a spark of indignation. He was lying, standing right there and lying to Mom's face about what had just happened. I tried to speak, to tell her the truth, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. He pushed me. But Mom wasn't listening to me. She was focused on Marcus, her face full of concern, but not for me, for him. "Oh, honey, you must be so scared. Don't worry, I'm sure Elena is fine. You know how she is, always tripping over her own feet." She knelt beside me then, but her touch was perfunctory, checking for obvious injuries without really seeing the pain in my eyes. "Elena, can you sit up? What happened, sweetie?" This was my chance. I looked up at her, tasting blood, feeling the throb of what would later turn out to be a mild concussion, and told her the truth. Marcus pushed me down the stairs. I was trying to bring up the decorations, and he pushed me. But even as the words left my mouth, I could see the doubt creeping into her expression. She glanced up at Marcus, who had put on his most innocent face, his eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine confusion and hurt. "Mom, I would never hurt Elena. You know that. I was in my room the whole time. She probably just lost her balance. You know how she gets when she's carrying too much stuff." She knelt beside me then, but her touch was perfunctory, checking for obvious injuries without really seeing the pain in my eyes. "Elena, can you sit up? What happened, sweetie?" This was my chance. I looked up at her, tasting blood, feeling the throb of what would later turn out to be a mild concussion, and told her the truth. Marcus pushed me down the stairs. I was trying to bring up the decorations, and he pushed me. But even as the words left my mouth, I could see the doubt creeping into her expression. She glanced up at Marcus, who had put on his most innocent face, his eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine confusion and hurt. "Mom, I would never hurt Elena. You know that. I was in my room the whole time. She probably just lost her balance. You know how she gets when she's carrying too much stuff." She knelt beside me then, but her touch was perfunctory, checking for obvious injuries without really seeing the pain in my eyes.
Elena, can you sit up? What happened, sweetie? This was my chance. I looked up at her, tasting blood, feeling the throb of what was later turn out to be a mild concussion, and told her the truth. Marcus pushed me down the stairs. I was trying to bring up the decorations, and he pushed me. But even as the words left my mouth, I could see the doubt creeping into her expression. She glanced up at Marcus, who had put on his most innocent face, his eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine confusion and hurt. Mom, I would never hurt Elena. You know that. I was in my room the whole time. She probably just lost her balance. You know how she gets when she's carrying too much stuff. She knelt beside me then, but her touch was perfunctory, checking for obvious injuries without really seeing the pain in my eyes. Elena, can you sit up? What happened, sweetie? This was my chance. I looked up at her, tasting blood, feeling the throb of what would later turn out to be a mild concussion, and told her the truth. Marcus pushed me down the stairs. I was trying to bring up the decorations, and he pushed me. But even as the words left my mouth, I could see the doubt creeping into her expression. She glanced up at Marcus, who had put on his most innocent face, his eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine confusion and hurt. Mom, I would never hurt Elena. You know that. I was in my room the whole time. She probably just lost her balance. You know how she gets when she's carrying too much stuff. I watched as Mom's expression shifted, and I could see her making the choice to believe him. It was easier, I suppose. Easier to believe that her clumsy younger daughter had simply fallen than to accept that her perfect son was capable of deliberate cruelty. Elena, honey, I think you might be confused. You hit your head pretty hard. Marcus would never push you down the stairs. That's a very serious accusation to make. Her voice was gentle but firm, and I could hear the finality in it. I felt something break inside me then, something that had nothing to do with my physical injuries. It was the moment I realized that the truth didn't matter as much as the story Mom wanted to believe. And the story she wanted to believe was that Marcus was incapable of wrongdoing, which meant that I was either lying or delusional. Marcus knelt down beside me then, and to anyone watching, he would have looked like the perfect concerned brother. But when he leaned close, pretending to check on me, he whispered something that only I could hear. If you tell anyone else about this, I'll make sure next time is worse, and nobody will believe you anyway. The threat sent ice through my veins, but it was the truth in his words that really hurt. Nobody would believe me. Even Mom, who was supposed to protect me, had already chosen sides. She helped me up to my room, clucking over my injuries, but treating them like the inevitable result of my own clumsiness. She cleaned my lip and gave me an ice pack for the swelling, all while lecturing me about being more careful on the stairs. And Elena, she said, as she prepared to leave my room, I don't want you telling people at school that Marcus pushed you. You know that's not what happened, and it would be very unfair to him. People might get the wrong idea. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I was beginning to understand that I was completely alone in this. Mom left me there with my ice pack and my pain, and I heard her go into Marcus's room to comfort him, to make sure he wasn't too traumatized by my accident. That night, as I lay in bed with my ribs aching and my head pounding, I did what I always did when I needed to process something difficult. I talked to the baby monitor, whispering my pain and confusion into the small white device that sat on my nightstand. He pushed me, I whispered into the darkness. He pushed me down the stairs, and she doesn't believe me. Nobody believes me. What I didn't know then was that every word was being recorded by that old receiver in the basement, the one Dad had left behind when he moved out. The one that still worked perfectly, even though the receiver in Mom's room had died years ago. The next few days passed in a blur of carefully hidden bruises and forced normalcy. At school, I told everyone I had fallen down the stairs, just like Mom wanted. The lie tasted bitter in my mouth, but I had learned that the truth was a luxury I couldn't afford. Marcus, meanwhile, was the picture of the caring older brother. He carried my books, helped me to my classes, and made a great show of being worried about my recovery. Everyone praised him for being so thoughtful, so protective of his clumsy little sister. But when we were alone, he was different. He would bump into me in the hallway, always making it look accidental. He would pinch my arm when no one was looking, hard enough to leave marks, but never hard enough to make me cry out. And always he would whisper those same words. Nobody will believe you. And for years, he was right. I stopped trying to tell Mom about the smaller cruelties, the daily humiliations that Marcus subjected me to whenever adults weren't watching. I learned to navigate around his moods, to make myself invisible when he was looking for someone to torment. I threw myself into my studies, finding solace in books and academic achievement. If I couldn't be the favorite child, I could at least be the successful one. I joined the debate team, where I learned to argue persuasively and think on my feet. I volunteered at the local animal shelter, where the unconditional love of abandoned dogs helped heal some of the wounds that my family had left in my heart. By the time I was in high school, I had built a life for myself outside of our dysfunctional family dynamic. I had friends who valued me, teachers who recognized my potential, and a growing sense of my own worth that didn't depend on Mom's approval or Marcus's mercy. But I never forgot what had happened on those stairs, and I never stopped talking to that baby monitor, treating it like a diary, a confidant, a witness to all the things I couldn't tell anyone else. Today, Marcus accidentally spilled soda on my science project, I would whisper to it. Mom said I should have been more careful about where I left it. Or, he told Jessica Morrison that I have a crush on her boyfriend, just to embarrass me. When I confronted him, he said I was being too sensitive. The baby monitor became my constant companion, the one place where I could be completely honest about what was happening in our house. And unbeknownst to me, it was faithfully recording every word in the basement, creating a detailed audio diary of years of abuse and gaslighting. When I was 16, I found out about the recording quite by accident. I was helping Mom clean out the basement when we moved houses, and I came across the old receiver tucked away behind Dad's abandoned workbench.
Curious, I plugged it in and pressed play, not expecting anything to happen. But what I heard made my blood run cold. My own voice, young and scared, came through the speakers. He pushed me down the stairs, and she doesn't believe me. Nobody believes me. I stood there in the dusty basement, listening to years of my own pain played back to me in crystal clear audio. There were hours and hours of recordings, a comprehensive documentation of every cruel thing Marcus had done and every time Mom had dismissed my complaints. For the first time in years, I had proof, real, undeniable proof of what had been done to me. But I wasn't ready to use it yet. I was still just 16, still dependent on Mom for everything, still living under the same roof as Marcus. So I carefully copied all the recordings onto a series of CDs, hiding them in a safe deposit box that I opened with money from my part-time job at the bookstore. I told myself I was saving them for the right moment, but the truth was, I was scared. Scared of what would happen when the truth finally came out. Scared of destroying what was left of our family. Scared that even with proof, no one would care. So I waited. I went to college on a full scholarship, studying journalism, because I had learned the power of stories, of bearing witness, of speaking truth to power. I built a life for myself hundreds miles away from Maple Street, surrounding myself with people who valued honesty and integrity. But Marcus followed me even there, not physically, but in the form of the trauma he had inflicted. I had nightmares about falling downstairs. I flinched when people approached me from behind. I struggled to trust authority figures, always wondering if they would dismiss my concerns the way Mom had dismissed mine. It took years of therapy to even begin to heal from what had been done to me, and even more years to understand that the abuse hadn't been my fault, that Mom's failure to protect me hadn't been because I was unworthy of protection, but because she had been unwilling to see the truth about her golden child. I became an investigative journalist, drawn to stories about people who had been silenced, whose voices had been dismissed or ignored. I wrote about corporate cover-ups, about powerful men who thought they were untouchable, about systems that protected perpetrators at the expense of victims. And through it all, those CDs sat in my safe deposit box, waiting. Marcus, meanwhile, had built what appeared to be a perfect life.
He became a successful lawyer, married a woman from a prominent family, and had two beautiful children. He was active in the community, coached Little League, and was frequently quoted in the local newspaper as an expert on family law. To everyone who knew him, he was the picture of success and respectability, the kind of man people pointed to as proof that good things happen to good people. But I knew better, and I had proof. The moment I had been waiting for finally came last month when Marcus decided to run for district attorney. His campaign was built on a platform of protecting families and children, of being tough on domestic violence and child abuse. The irony was so thick I could choke on it. I watched his campaign launch on the local news, sitting in my apartment 3 states away, and felt something shift inside me. He was standing there at the podium, talking about his commitment to justice, his dedication to protecting the vulnerable, his understanding of how trauma affects families. And I thought about that 12-year-old girl lying at the bottom of the stairs, begging her mother to believe her, while her abuser stood above her and lied. That night, I called my editor and pitched a story about political candidates with histories of domestic violence. She was interested immediately, especially when I told her I had exclusive audio evidence of incidents involving one particular candidate. How exclusive? She asked. So exclusive that no one else even knows it exists, I told her. The next morning, I drove to the bank and retrieved those CDs for the first time in years. My hands were shaking as I held them, all that pain and fear condensed into a few pieces of plastic and metal. But I also felt something I hadn't expected: power. For the first time since I was 12 years old, I held the ability to make people listen to me, to make them hear the truth about what Marcus really was. Not the charming lawyer or the devoted family man or the community leader, but the cruel teenager who had pushed his sister down the stairs and then convinced everyone it was her fault. I spent the next week going through the recordings, selecting the most damning pieces, the ones that told the clearest story. There was the original incident, of course, my young voice describing the push and Mom's refusal to believe me. But there were also years of follow-up entries, documenting a pattern of abuse and manipulation that painted a picture of systematic cruelty. There was the recording from when I was 14. Marcus told everyone at school that I wet the bed until I was 10. It wasn't true, but now everyone believes it. When I asked him why he did it, he said it was just a joke. When I told Mom, she said I shouldn't be so sensitive about jokes. And from when I was 15, he broke my laptop and told Mom that I dropped it. She made me pay for a new one with my babysitting money. He was laughing when she yelled at me for being careless. And from when I was 17, Mom found my diary and read it to Marcus for context when I tried to tell her about him stealing money from my wallet. She said she was trying to understand why I was making up stories about him. He smiled the whole time she was reading the private things I wrote about feeling lonely and afraid. Each recording was a piece of a larger puzzle, a comprehensive documentation of not just Marcus's cruelty, but of Mom's complicity in enabling it. Together, they told the story of a family system that had been built around protecting and elevating one child at the expense of the other. I had everything I needed to destroy Marcus's political ambitions and probably his legal career as well. The question was whether I had the courage to actually do it. The answer came when I saw his first television commercial, a slick production that featured him talking directly to the camera about his commitment to justice. Behind him were photos of children, including what appeared to be a school photo of me from when I was about 12, around the time of the staircase incident. As a big brother, he said in his smooth, practiced voice, I learned early that our most important job is to protect those who can't protect themselves. That's what I've dedicated my career to, and it's what I'll bring to the district attorney's office. I stared at the screen in disbelief. He was using an image of me, his victim, to promote his campaign built on lies about who he really was. It was a level of manipulation and gall that took my breath away. That night, I made my decision. I called my editor and told her the story was ready. The article went live on a Thursday morning with the headline, DA Candidate's Dark Family Secret. Exclusive audio reveals pattern of child abuse. I had worked with our legal team to make sure every word could be defended, every claim backed up with evidence. But the real power was in the recordings themselves. We embedded key excerpts throughout the article, letting readers hear my 12-year-old voice describing the push, my teenage voice documenting years of smaller cruelties, and most damning of all, several instances where Marcus could be heard in the background making threats when he thought no one was listening. The story went viral within hours. Local news stations picked it up first, then regional outlets, and finally national media. Social media exploded with outrage and support. Hashtags like #BelieveSurvivors and #JusticeForElena started trending. Marcus's campaign tried to dismiss it as a political hit job, claiming that I had fabricated the recordings or taken them out of context. But audio experts confirmed their authenticity, and the sheer volume of evidence made it impossible to explain away. Within 48 hours, Marcus had dropped out of the race. Within a week, his law firm had suspended him, pending an internal investigation. Within 2 weeks, his wife had filed for divorce and moved back to her parents' house with their children. The golden child had finally fallen, and this time, no one could dismiss it as clumsiness.
But the story was far from over. The real reckoning was still to come, and it would involve confronting not just Marcus, but the mother who had enabled him, the family system that had protected him, and the little girl inside me who had been waiting 15 years for someone to finally believe her. The baby monitor that had been my only witness for so many years had finally fulfilled its purpose, giving voice to the voiceless and bringing truth to light in a way I never could have imagined when I was 12 years old and lying broken at the bottom of our stairs. But justice, I was about to learn, is more complicated than simply exposing the truth. And revenge, even when it's justified, comes with costs that I was only beginning to understand. The phone calls started within hours of the story breaking. My editor Sarah called first, her voice barely containing her excitement as she rattled off the engagement numbers and media pickup statistics. Then came the interview requests from national news programs, podcast hosts, and documentary filmmakers. My phone buzzed incessantly with notifications from social media platforms where strangers were sharing their own stories of family abuse and thanking me for my courage. But it was the silence from Maple Street that spoke the loudest. I sat in my downtown apartment, 3 states away from the house where it all began, watching the media storm unfold from what felt like the eye of the hurricane. The view from my 20th floor window showed the city spreading out below me like a circuit board, all gleaming lights and purposeful movement. It was a life I had built deliberately, far from the shadows of my childhood, surrounded by the kind of people who valued truth over comfort. The first call from home came on Friday evening, exactly 24 hours after the story went live. The caller ID showed Mom's number, and I stared at it for several rings before answering, my finger hovering over the decline button. When I finally picked up, her voice was different than I remembered. Smaller somehow, fragile in a way that seemed alien, coming from the woman who had always projected such confidence in her parenting choices. "Elena, honey, we need to talk." The endearment felt foreign after years of carefully polite distance between us. Since college, our conversations had been limited to obligatory holiday check-ins and brief updates about my career that she never seemed particularly interested in hearing. "Do we?" I kept my voice level, professional. It was a tone I had perfected during years of difficult interviews, a way of maintaining control while gathering information. What you've done, Elena, this is destroying Marcus. His whole life is falling apart. His wife, his children, his career, everything. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the old programming that told me I was responsible for managing everyone else's emotions, for making myself smaller so that others could be more comfortable. But I had spent years in therapy learning to recognize that feeling and resist it. His life is falling apart because the truth finally came out, Mom, not because I told it. But those recordings, Elena, you were just a child. Children misunderstand things, they misremember. And to keep them all these years, to use them now when he's trying to build something important? The implication hung in the air between us, that I had misunderstood what happened to me, that my memories were unreliable, that my pain was less important than Marcus's ambitions. It was the same dismissal I had received 15 years ago, dressed up in slightly gentler language. I didn't misunderstand anything, Mom, and those recordings aren't just from when I was 12.
They document years of abuse that you chose not to see. Abuse? Her voice sharpened with what sounded like genuine surprise. Elena, that's a very strong word. Marcus was never abusive. He was a typical older brother, maybe a little rough around the edges, but boys will be boys. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. Boys will be boys? The universal excuse that had been used to justify decades of cruelty. The magic words that transformed deliberate harm into inevitable mischief. I thought about all the stories I had covered as a journalist, all the women who had been told that their experiences didn't matter because boys will be boys. He pushed me down a flight of stairs, Mom. That's not typical sibling rivalry, that's assault. You fell, Elena. You've always been dramatic about these things. Even as a little girl, you would blow small incidents out of proportion. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to center myself. This was exactly what I had expected, but it still felt like swallowing glass to hear it. The woman who was supposed to have protected me was still protecting him, even now, even with incontrovertible evidence of what he had done. There are recordings, Mom, hours of them. You can hear my voice, you can hear his threats, you can hear yourself dismissing my concerns year after year. It's all there. Recordings can be edited, taken out of context. Elena, I'm your mother, and I know what happened in my own house. The audacity of it took my breath away. Even faced with proof, she was clinging to her version of events. The one where Marcus was incapable of wrongdoing, and I was a troubled child who fabricated stories for attention. Actually, Mom, you don't know what happened in your house, because you chose not to see it. You chose to believe Marcus over me, every single time, even when the evidence was right in front of you. The silence stretched between us, filled with years of accumulated resentment and disappointment.
When she spoke again, her voice had taken on a pleading quality that I had never heard before. Elena, please, I'm begging you. Call the reporters, tell them you made a mistake. Say you were confused, that you mixed up your memories with something you saw on television. We can fix this. We can make it go away. The request was so outrageous, so completely tone-deaf, that I almost laughed. She wanted me to publicly recant my own abuse, to humiliate myself and invalidate my own experiences, all to protect the man who had tormented me for years. No, Mom, I won't do that. I won't lie to protect him, not anymore. Then you're destroying this family, Elena. Is that what you want? Is this how you want to be remembered? It was a manipulation tactic I recognized from my childhood, the implication that I was responsible for the family's dysfunction, that my refusal to stay silent was the real problem. But I was 32 years old now, not 12, and I had learned to see these patterns for what they were. I'm not destroying anything, Mom. I'm just refusing to keep secrets anymore. The family was already broken. I'm just the first person willing to admit it. She hung up without saying goodbye, and I sat in the gathering darkness of my apartment, feeling strangely hollow. Part of me had hoped, despite everything, that she might surprise me, that when faced with the truth, she might find the strength to acknowledge what had been done to me, to offer the apology and support I had craved for so many years. But that hope had been naive. Mom had spent 15 years perfecting her denial, and she wasn't about to abandon it now. The weekend brought a new wave of media attention. The story had been picked up by several major news networks, and I found myself fielding interview requests from journalists I had admired for years. Sarah had arranged for a publicist to help manage the requests, and my calendar filled up with television appearances and podcast recordings. On Monday morning, I was scheduled to appear on a national morning show to discuss the story and its implications for political candidates with histories of domestic violence. As I sat in the green room waiting for my segment, I scrolled through social media and was amazed by the response. The hashtag #BelieveSurvivors had taken on a life of its own, with thousands of people sharing their own stories of childhood abuse and family denial. Many of them mentioned my article specifically, saying that hearing the recordings had given them the courage to speak about their own experiences. But there was also a darker side to the attention. Marcus's supporters, particularly in his hometown, had launched a campaign to discredit me.
They questioned my motives, suggesting that I was seeking fame or trying to destroy a good man out of sibling jealousy. Some of the comments were viciously personal, attacking everything from my appearance to my credibility as a journalist. The most painful attacks came from people who had known our family when we were children. Former neighbors and family friends posted on social media about what a sweet boy Marcus had been, how troubled I had always seemed, how they had never seen any signs of abuse. It was a masterclass in gaslighting conducted in real time, with dozens of people reshaping history to protect their preferred narrative. But for every person who defended Marcus, there were 10 more who supported me. Other journalists shared the story with commentary about the importance of believing survivors and holding powerful people accountable. Child welfare advocates used it as an example of how family systems often protect abusers at the expense of victims. The morning show interview went well. The host was prepared and respectful, asking thoughtful questions about the long-term effects of childhood abuse and the challenges of speaking out against family members. When she asked about my decision to wait so many years before going public, I was ready with an answer I had practiced. Trauma operates on its own timeline, I said, looking directly into the camera. Survivors speak out when they're ready, when they feel safe, when they have the support and resources they need. For me, that time came when I saw Marcus using his image as a protective big brother to build a political career. I couldn't let him profit from a lie. After the interview, I had lunch with Sarah at a restaurant near the studio. She was energized by the story's impact, already talking about follow-up pieces and investigation into how many other political candidates might have similar histories. "You know this is just the beginning, right?" she said, cutting into her salad with characteristic precision. "This story has opened a door that a lot of people are going to want to walk through." I nodded, though part of me was still processing the personal cost of opening that door. The professional satisfaction of breaking an important story was complicated by the emotional toll of reliving my trauma in such a public way. "I've been getting calls from other survivors," I told her, "people who say they have evidence of abuse by powerful figures but were afraid to come forward. This has given them hope that someone will actually listen." Sarah's eyes lit up. "That's exactly what I was hoping for. We could develop this into a series, investigate the intersection of childhood trauma and adult power structures. You could be the lead on it." The opportunity was tempting, both professionally and personally. The idea of using my experience to help other survivors tell their stories felt like a way of transforming my pain into something meaningful. But I also knew that it would mean staying in this space indefinitely, making my trauma the cornerstone of my career. "Let me think about it," I said. "I want to see how this plays out first." That afternoon, as I was walking back to my apartment, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The area code was from my hometown, and something told me to answer. "Elena, this is David Chen. I'm Marcus's campaign manager. Well, former campaign manager." I had seen David's name in the news coverage of Marcus's campaign suspension. He was a well-respected political operative who had managed successful campaigns for several state-level candidates. "What can I do for you, David?" I wanted to call and, well, first, to apologize. I had no idea about Marcus's history when I agreed to work with him. If I had known, I never would have taken the job. His voice sounded genuinely distressed, and I found myself curious about what else he might have to say. "I appreciate that," I said.
But that's not the only reason I'm calling. Elena, there are things about Marcus's campaign, about his behavior during the time I worked with him, that I think you should know about. I stopped walking, finding a quiet spot on the sidewalk where I could focus on the conversation. What kind of things? Incidents with female staff members, comments that made people uncomfortable, a pattern of behavior that, well, that makes a lot more sense now that I've heard your story. My pulse quickened. If Marcus had been inappropriate with campaign staff, it could be evidence of a broader pattern of abusive behavior that extended into his adult life. Would any of these women be willing to talk to me? I think so. I've already reached out to a few of them, and they're interested in speaking with someone they trust. Your story has given them courage, Elena. They feel like someone might actually believe them now. We arranged to meet the following day at a coffee shop in his city, about 2 hours' drive from where I was staying.
As I hung up the phone, I felt the familiar surge of investigative adrenaline that came with discovering a new thread to pull. The next morning, I rented a car and drove to meet David. The coffee shop he had chosen was small and quiet, the kind of place where conversations could be held without attracting attention. He was waiting for me when I arrived, a thin man in his 40s with prematurely gray hair and tired eyes. "Thank you for coming," he said as I sat down across from him. "I've been carrying this around for weeks, and after your story came out, I knew I had to do something." He pulled out a folder and placed it on the table between us. "These are internal campaign documents, emails, incident reports, complaint forms that were filed but never acted on." I opened the folder and began reading. The first document was an email from a young woman named Jessica, a college intern who had been assigned to help with Marcus's social media presence. She was writing to David about an incident at a campaign event where Marcus had cornered her in a supply closet and made inappropriate comments about her appearance. "He said I reminded him of his sister when she was my age," the email read. "He said his sister had always been too sensitive about attention from men and that I seemed like I knew how to appreciate it better. Then he touched my hair and said I smelled nice. When I tried to leave, he blocked the door for a few seconds before stepping aside. It felt like a warning." The reference to me made my skin crawl. Marcus had used me as a comparison point while making another young woman uncomfortable, turning my own experiences into a tool for manipulation. The next document was from a staff member named Caroline, who had been working on opposition research. She described an incident where Marcus had become angry about a report she had prepared, accusing her of being hysterical and emotional like all women who can't handle pressure. When she had tried to defend her work, he had grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave marks and told her she needed to learn when to keep her mouth shut. "I took photos of the bruises," Caroline had written to David, "but I don't know what to do with them. He's the candidate. Everyone loves him. Who's going to believe me?" There were 5 more similar reports, each describing a pattern of behavior that was disturbingly familiar. Marcus using his charm and authority to make women uncomfortable, then dismissing their concerns or implying that they were overreacting. The same tactics he had used on me as children, refined and deployed in professional settings. "Why didn't you fire him?" I asked David, though I already suspected the answer. "I tried to address it," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I talked to him about appropriate workplace behavior, suggested he take a training course on professional conduct, but he just laughed it off, said the women were misunderstanding his friendly nature. And honestly, Alina, he was so charismatic, so good at explaining away the complaints, that I started to doubt whether they were really as serious as they seemed." It was the same dynamic that had played out in our family, scaled up to a professional environment. Marcus's charm and credibility protecting him from accountability, while his victims were left to question their own perceptions and experiences. Would these women be willing to go on the record? Jessica and Caroline definitely would. The others might need more time, but I think your story has changed the calculation for a lot of people. They feel like someone might actually listen now. I spent the rest of the afternoon interviewing Jessica and Caroline, both of whom had driven to meet me at David's request. Their stories were disturbingly consistent with what I knew about Marcus's behavior patterns, and both women had preserved evidence of their interactions with him. Jessica had screenshots of text messages where Marcus had contacted her after hours, asking personal questions about her dating life and making comments about her social media photos. Caroline had not only photos of her bruises, but also emails where Marcus had apologized for misunderstanding the situation while simultaneously suggesting that she had misinterpreted his actions. As I drove back to my hotel that evening, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. These women had trusted me with their stories because of my own public disclosure, and now I had an obligation to help them be heard. But I also felt a grim satisfaction in knowing that my instincts had been correct. Marcus hadn't outgrown his abusive tendencies. He had simply learned to be more careful about his targets and more sophisticated in his manipulation tactics. That night, I called Sarah and told her about the new information. She was immediately interested in pursuing a follow-up story, but she also urged caution. "We need to be absolutely bulletproof on this," she said. Marcus's people are going to fight back hard, and they'll look for any excuse to discredit these women the same way they've been trying to discredit you. She was right, of course. The first story had been relatively safe because I had clear audio evidence and no obvious ulterior motive. But pursuing Marcus's workplace behavior would be more complicated, requiring careful verification and extensive legal review. Give me a week, I told her. Let me do some more research, maybe find additional sources. I want to make sure we have everything we need before we publish. The week that followed was intense and focused in a way that reminded me why I had become a journalist in the first place. I spent hours on the phone with sources, tracking down former campaign staffers and volunteers who might have witnessed inappropriate behavior. I reviewed public records, looking through patterns in Marcus's professional history that might corroborate the women's accounts. What I found was disturbing, but not surprising. Marcus had worked at 3 different law firms over the course of his career, leaving each one under circumstances that were never fully explained. When I reached out to former colleagues, many were reluctant to speak on the record, but several confirmed that there had been personnel issues and complaints about professionalism. One former paralegal, speaking on condition of anonymity, told me about an incident where Marcus had made her so uncomfortable during a business trip that she had requested a transfer to a different department. Another lawyer who had worked with him early in his career described him as brilliant but problematic, someone who didn't seem to understand appropriate boundaries with female colleagues. The pattern was clear. Marcus had been using his charm and professional success to mask a consistent pattern of inappropriate behavior towards women. And just like in our family, the systems around him had chosen to protect his reputation rather than address the underlying problem. "Why didn't you fire him?" I asked David, though I already suspected the answer. "I tried to address it," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I talked to him about appropriate workplace behavior, suggested he take a training course on professional conduct. But he just laughed it off, said the women were misunderstanding his friendly nature. And honestly, Alina, he was so charismatic, so good at explaining away the complaints, that I started to doubt whether they were really as serious as they seemed." It was the same dynamic that had played out in our family, scaled up to a professional environment. Marcus's charm and credibility protecting him from accountability, while his victims were left to question their own perceptions and experiences. Would these women be willing to go on the record? Jessica and Caroline definitely would. The others might need more time, but I think your story has changed the calculation for a lot of people. They feel like someone might actually listen now. I spent the rest of the afternoon interviewing Jessica and Caroline, both of whom had driven to meet me at David's request. Their stories were disturbingly consistent with what I knew about Marcus's behavior patterns, and both women had preserved evidence of their interactions with him. Jessica had screenshots of text messages where Marcus had contacted her after hours, asking personal questions about her dating life and making comments about her social media photos. Caroline had not only photos of her bruises, but also emails where Marcus had apologized for misunderstanding the situation while simultaneously suggesting that she had misinterpreted his actions. As I drove back to my hotel that evening, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. These women had trusted me with their stories because of my own public disclosure, and now I had an obligation to help them be heard. But I also felt a grim satisfaction in knowing that my instincts had been correct. Marcus hadn't outgrown his abusive tendencies. He had simply learned to be more careful about his targets and more sophisticated in his manipulation tactics. That night, I called Sarah and told her about the new information. She was immediately interested in pursuing a follow-up story, but she also urged caution. "We need to be absolutely bulletproof on this," she said. "Marcus's people are going to fight back hard, and they'll look for any excuse to discredit these women the same way they've been trying to discredit you." She was right, of course. The first story had been relatively safe because I had clear audio evidence and no obvious ulterior motive. But pursuing Marcus's workplace behavior would be more complicated, requiring careful verification and extensive legal review. "Give me a week," I told her. "Let me do some more research, maybe find additional sources. I want to make sure we have everything we need before we publish." The week that followed was intense and focused in a way that reminded me why I had become a journalist in the first place. I spent hours on the phone with sources, tracking down By the end of the week, I had enough material for a comprehensive follow-up story. Sarah and our legal team reviewed everything carefully, and we were confident that we could publish without fear of litigation. The second story ran the following Monday with the headline, Pattern of Abuse, New Allegations Against Former DA Candidate Span Decades. This time, the response was even more intense than the first story. Marcus's few remaining supporters could no longer dismiss the allegations as sibling rivalry or childhood misunderstandings. This was evidence of adult behavior, documented and corroborated, that painted a picture of a man who had never learned to respect women's autonomy or boundaries. The legal implications were immediate and severe. The State Bar Association announced that they were opening an investigation into Marcus's conduct. The law firm where he had been working placed him on administrative leave pending their own internal review. His wife's divorce attorney filed for an emergency custody hearing, citing concerns about the children's safety. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. The district attorney's office in our hometown announced that they were opening a criminal investigation into the original staircase incident. Apparently, the statute of limitations for child abuse didn't apply when there was clear evidence of the crime, and my audio recordings constituted exactly that kind of evidence. When the investigator called to schedule an interview, I felt a mixture of vindication and terror. After 20 years, someone was finally taking my accusations seriously enough to pursue criminal charges. But it also meant that I would have to relive the trauma in even more detail, submit to questioning by lawyers whose job it would be to poke holes in my story. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah asked when I told her about the investigation. "I don't think anyone's ever ready for something like this," I said. "But I'm willing to do it. Those recordings have been waiting 20 years to be heard in a courtroom." The investigation moved quickly once it began. The audio evidence was so clear and comprehensive that there was little doubt about what had happened. Marcus's own voice could be heard on several recordings, making threats and admitting to actions that corroborated my account of events. His attorney tried to argue that the recordings had been obtained illegally, but the prosecutor pointed out that I had been a minor, living in my own home, using a device that belonged to me. There was no expectation of privacy for Marcus in those circumstances, and I had every right to record conversations in my own bedroom. The criminal charges were filed on a Thursday morning, assault in the third degree for the staircase incident, plus multiple counts of stalking and intimidation for the pattern of threats that followed. The charges were serious enough to carry potential jail time, and when combined with the civil lawsuits that were being filed by his former campaign workers, Marcus was facing the complete destruction of his professional and personal life. I should have felt triumphant. After 20 years of being dismissed and disbelieved, the system was finally acknowledging that I had been telling the truth all along. Marcus was facing real consequences for his actions, and other survivors were finding the courage to speak out about their own experiences. But what I actually felt was a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and something approaching grief. The family I had grown up in was truly gone now, not just distant, but actively hostile. Mom had stopped calling after the second story came out, and I knew that she blamed me for everything that had happened. The little girl inside me who had always hoped for her mother's love and protection was finally forced to accept that it would never come. And while the adult woman I had become knew that this was the right thing to do, it still hurt in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. The criminal trial was scheduled for the following spring, and I knew that the intervening months would be filled with depositions, media attention, and probably more attempts by Marcus's supporters to discredit me. But for the first time since I was 12 years old, I felt like I was fighting from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. The baby monitor that had been my only witness for so many years had finally done its job. The truth was out, the consequences were real, and no one could ever again dismiss my experiences as the fantasies of a troubled child. Justice, I was learning, was more complicated and more painful than I had imagined. The courthouse steps were slick with morning rain as I walked toward the building that would determine the final chapter of a story that began 20 years ago on our staircase. My hands gripped the handles of my briefcase tighter than necessary, the leather worn smooth from months of preparation meetings with prosecutors, victim advocates, and therapists who had helped me prepare for this moment. Spring had arrived early that year, and the cherry trees lining the courthouse walkway were blooming despite the gray sky overhead. I found something oddly fitting about that contrast: beauty emerging from harsh conditions, new growth pushing through despite the lingering cold. The media presence was substantial. My story had become something of a watershed moment in conversations about childhood abuse and family denial, and several documentary crews had been following the case with my permission. But today felt different from the initial media circus that had followed my articles. Today felt quieter, more focused, like the whole world was holding its breath to see how this would end. Sarah met me at the courthouse entrance, her usually perfect composure showing small cracks of nervousness. She had become more than just my editor over the past year. She had become a friend, an advocate, and sometimes the voice of reason when the weight of everything threatened to overwhelm me. "How are you feeling?" she asked, following into step beside me as we navigated through the security checkpoint. "Like I'm about to testify against my own brother in a criminal trial," I said, trying to inject some lightness into my voice. "So, just another Tuesday." She smiled at that, but I could see the concern in her eyes. The trial had been postponed twice due to various legal maneuvers by Marcus's defense team, and the waiting had been almost as difficult as the original decision to come forward. Each delay meant more time for doubt to creep in, more opportunities for Marcus's supporters to try to discredit me, more sleepless nights wondering if I was doing the right thing. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that gave everything a slightly institutional feel. Marcus was already seated at the defense table with his attorney, a expensive-looking woman named Victoria Chen, who had made her reputation defending high-profile white-collar criminals. He looked older than when I had last seen him, his hair showing gray at the temples and his face carrying a weight that hadn't been there during his campaign days. When he turned to look at me as I entered the courtroom, our eyes met for just a moment. I had wondered what I would feel in that instant, whether anger or fear or sadness would dominate. Instead, I felt something unexpected: pity. The golden child who had seemed so powerful and untouchable during our childhood looked diminished, almost fragile, sitting there in his too expensive suit waiting to be judged for crimes he had committed half a lifetime ago. The prosecution team was led by District Attorney Patricia Moreau, a woman in her 50s who had built her career on cases involving domestic violence and child abuse. During our preparation meetings, she had been thorough but compassionate, walking me through what to expect while making it clear that my testimony would be the cornerstone of the state's case. "Remember," she had told me during our final preparation session, "this isn't about revenge. This is about justice. This is about making sure that what happened to you is acknowledged by the legal system and that Marcus faces appropriate consequences for his actions." The distinction had been important for me to understand. Revenge was personal, emotional, driven by a desire to cause pain in return for pain received. Justice was institutional, measured, focused on accountability and the protection of society. What I wanted wasn't to destroy Marcus for the sake of destruction, but to ensure that his actions had consequences and that other potential victims would be protected. The trial began with opening statements that laid out the basic facts of the case in stark legal language. Marcus had pushed me down a flight of stairs when I was 12 years old, causing physical injury and psychological trauma. He had then engaged in a pattern of intimidation and threats to prevent me from reporting the abuse. The evidence consisted primarily of my audio recordings, supplemented by medical records from my treatment after the incident and testimony from expert witnesses about the long-term effects of childhood trauma. Marcus's defense strategy became clear during Victoria Chen's opening statement. She didn't deny that the incident had occurred, which would have been impossible given the audio evidence. Instead, she focused on characterizing it as a momentary lapse in judgment by a teenage boy, a single incident that had been blown out of proportion by a vindictive sister seeking attention and revenge. She painted a picture of Marcus as a reformed man who had learned from his mistakes, built a successful career helping families, and been unfairly targeted by a sister who couldn't let go of childhood grievances. It was a narrative that felt familiar from our childhood, where Marcus's actions were always minimized while my reactions were portrayed as excessive. But the audio recordings made that defense difficult to maintain.
When the prosecution played the first excerpt during their case in chief, the courtroom fell completely silent. My 12-year-old voice, small and scared and hurt, filled the space with words that were impossible to dismiss or recontextualize. He pushed me down the stairs, and she doesn't believe me. Nobody believes me. The impact on the jury was visible. Several of them shifted in their seats, and I saw one woman wipe away tears. The recordings weren't just evidence of what Marcus had done. They were evidence of a child in pain, a little girl who had been failed by the adults who were supposed to protect her. The prosecution played excerpts strategically throughout their case, each one building on the last to create a comprehensive picture of sustained abuse and family dysfunction. They included not just the recordings from immediately after the staircase incident, but also entries from months and years later that documented Marcus's ongoing threats and Mom's continued dismissal of my concerns. One of the most powerful recordings came from when I was 14, shortly after Marcus had humiliated me at a school event by telling everyone about an embarrassing personal secret I had shared with him in confidence. I asked him why he told everyone about what happened at camp, my teenage voice said to the baby monitor. He said it was because I needed to learn that nobody really cares about my feelings except him, and that if I ever tried to get him in trouble again, he would make sure everyone knew all my secrets. He said he was the only person who would ever really understand me, and that I should be grateful he was teaching me how the world really works. The manipulation and emotional abuse in that recording was unmistakable. It wasn't just about the physical violence of the staircase incident. It was about a sustained campaign to control and intimidate me, to make me believe that I was dependent on Marcus's approval and that no one else would ever believe or support me. When it came time for me to testify, I felt surprisingly calm. I had spent months preparing for this moment, working with therapists and prosecutors to organize my thoughts and emotions in a way that would be helpful to the jury. The courtroom felt less like a place of judgment and more like a place where truth could finally be spoken and heard. Patricia Moreau walked me through my testimony methodically, starting with my childhood memories of the incident and moving through the years of consequences that followed. I described the physical injuries, the ongoing fear, the way the abuse had affected my ability to trust authority figures and form healthy relationships. "How did this incident change your relationship with your family?" she asked, looking directly at the jury. "It taught me that my safety and well-being were less important than protecting Marcus's reputation," I said, looking directly at the jury. "It taught me that my voice didn't matter, that my experiences could be dismissed if they were inconvenient for other people. It took me years of therapy to understand that what happened to me was real and significant, regardless of whether my family was willing to acknowledge it." The cross-examination was more difficult, as I had expected it would be. Victoria Chen was skilled at her job, and she probed for inconsistencies in my testimony, questioned my motivations for coming forward after so many years, and tried to suggest that my recordings had been taken out of context or manipulated in some way. "Isn't it true, Miss Rodriguez, that you waited to come forward with these allegations until your brother was running for public office?" she asked, her tone suggesting that this timing was somehow suspicious. "Yes, that's true," I answered. "I came forward when I saw Marcus using his image as a protective big brother to build a political career based on fighting child abuse. I couldn't let him profit from a lie about who he really was." "So this is about politics, not justice?" "No," I said firmly. "This is about the fact that abusers shouldn't be allowed to use their public image to gain power over other people, especially when that image is based on concealing their own history of abuse." She tried several more approaches, suggesting that I was motivated by professional ambition, sibling jealousy, or a desire for attention. But the audio recordings made most of her attacks irrelevant. Whatever my motivations might have been for coming forward, the evidence of what Marcus had done was clear and undeniable. The most emotionally difficult part of the trial came when Marcus himself took the stand in his own defense. His testimony was carefully crafted to acknowledge responsibility while minimizing the severity of his actions. He admitted to pushing me down the stairs, but characterized it as a momentary loss of control during a typical sibling argument. "I was 15 years old and dealing with my own problems," he said, his voice carrying just the right note of regret.
My parents were going through a difficult divorce, I was struggling in school, and I took out my frustrations on Elena in a way that was completely inappropriate. I've regretted that moment every day since it happened. It was a performance worthy of the charm that had protected him throughout our childhood, and I could see that some jury members were moved by it. He talked about the therapy he had undergone, the anger management courses he had completed, the ways he had tried to make amends for his teenage mistakes. But when Patricia Moreau cross-examined him, the carefully constructed image began to crack. She played audio recordings where Marcus could be heard making threats to me months and years after the original incident, proving that his behavior hadn't been a single moment of teenage anger, but a sustained pattern of abuse. Mr. Chen, in this recording from 3 years after the staircase incident, we can hear you telling Elena that if she ever told lies about you again, you would make sure she regretted it. Does that sound like someone who was remorseful about his actions? Marcus struggled to explain away the recordings, claiming that he didn't remember making those statements or that they had been taken out of context. But his explanations sounded hollow when played against the clear audio evidence of his own voice making specific threats. The most damaging moment came when Patricia played a recording from when I was 16, shortly before I left for college. Marcus's voice was clear and unmistakable as he spoke to me in what he thought was private. "You think you're so smart, going off to college, getting away from here," his recorded voice said. "But you'll never really get away from me, Elena. I'll always be your big brother, and I'll always know exactly how to hurt you if you step out of line. Remember that when you're tempted to tell people stories about our family." The jury's reaction to that recording was visibly negative. Several members shook their heads, and I saw one man mouth the word disgusting under his breath. It was impossible to characterize that statement as anything other than a deliberate threat designed to maintain control over me through fear. After both sides rested their cases, the jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning with their verdict. I sat in the courtroom with Sarah and Patricia Moreau, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, trying to prepare myself for either outcome. When the jury foreman stood to read the verdict, the courtroom fell completely silent. On the charge of assault in the 3rd degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charges of stalking and intimidation, we find the defendant guilty on all counts. The relief that washed over me was so intense that I actually felt dizzy. After 20 years of being told that my experiences didn't matter, a jury of 12 strangers had looked at the evidence and declared definitively that Marcus was guilty of the crimes he had committed against me. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, but the conviction itself felt like the most important victory. Marcus would likely receive probation and community service rather than jail time, given that these were his first criminal convictions and the crimes had occurred when he was a minor. But the legal system had officially acknowledged that what happened to me was real, significant, and criminal. Outside the courthouse, I gave a brief statement to the media gathered on the steps. "Today's verdict isn't just about me," I said, reading from notes I had prepared. "It's about every child who has been abused by someone they trusted, every survivor who has been told that their experiences don't matter, every family that has chosen to protect abusers instead of victims. The justice system has declared that abuse is abuse, regardless of when it's reported or who the perpetrator might be." The questions from reporters were respectful but probing. They wanted to know how they felt about Marcus's conviction, whether they thought the sentence would be adequate, what message this case would send to other survivors. "I hope this case shows other survivors that it's never too late to speak your truth," I said. "I hope it shows families that protecting abusers doesn't actually protect anyone. It just enables more abuse. And I hope it shows potential abusers that there are consequences for their actions, even if those consequences come years later." That evening, I had dinner with Sarah and the prosecution team at a quiet restaurant near my hotel. The mood was celebratory but subdued. We all understood that justice was complicated and that winning a conviction didn't erase the years of trauma that had preceded it. "What's next for you?" Patricia asked over dessert. "I'm not sure," I said honestly. "Part of me wants to go back to my regular journalism work, cover stories that don't involve my own family drama.
But I've also been contacted by a lot of other survivors who want help telling their stories. There might be value in continuing to work in this space."
Whatever you decide, Patricia said, you should know that you've already made a significant impact. This case is going to be cited in law schools, used in training programs for prosecutors and social workers. You've changed how the legal system thinks about delayed reporting and family abuse. The conversation continued late into the evening, but eventually we all headed back to our respective hotels. I sat in my room, looking out at the city lights and trying to process everything that had happened. The trial was over, Marcus had been convicted, and I had finally received the official acknowledgement that my experiences were real and significant. But the most profound change wasn't in the external validation, it was in my own sense of self. The little girl who had been told that her pain didn't matter had grown into a woman who had the courage and resources to demand justice. The child who had been silenced had found her voice and used it to speak truth in the most powerful forum available. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call. The number was from my hometown, but it wasn't Mom's. When I answered, I heard a voice I hadn't heard in over a year. "Elena, this is your Aunt Patricia, your mom's sister." I had always liked Aunt Patricia, though we hadn't stayed in close touch over the years. She was the kind of person who said what she meant and didn't have much patience for family drama or dysfunction. "Hi, Aunt Patricia. How are you?" "I'm calling because I wanted you to know that not everyone in this family thinks you did the wrong thing," she said without preamble. "I've been watching the trial coverage, and I'm proud of you for having the courage to speak up." The words hit me harder than I had expected. For so long, I had felt completely isolated from my extended family, assuming that everyone had chosen sides and that I was on the losing team. "Thank you," I said, my voice catching slightly. "That means more to me than you might realize." "Elena, there are things about your childhood that I saw but didn't speak up about, things I should have done differently. I want you to know that I'm sorry for that, and I want you to know that you're not alone." She went on to tell me that several other family members had privately expressed support for my decision to come forward, but that they felt caught between loyalty to Mom and recognition that I had been treated unfairly. It was a complicated family dynamic that I recognized all too well, but it was also the first indication that the narrative wasn't as one-sided as I had believed. "Your mom is having a hard time with all of this," Aunt Patricia continued. "She's not ready to admit that she made mistakes, but I think someday she might be. In the meantime, you should know that you have family members who support you and who are proud of what you've accomplished." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Aunt Patricia sharing observations about our family dynamics that helped me understand some of the patterns I had experienced as a child. She talked about Mom's own difficult childhood, her tendency to avoid conflict by denying problems, and her deep investment in the idea that she had raised perfect children. "None of that excuses what happened to you," she made clear, "but it might help you understand why she reacted the way she did." After we hung up, I sat with the phone in my hands, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. The family I had thought was completely lost to me might not be as gone as I had believed. But I also knew that any reconciliation would have to happen on my terms, with acknowledgement of what had been done to me and genuine accountability from the people who had failed to protect me. The sentencing hearing took place on a warm day in early summer. Marcus received 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and a requirement to continue therapy for anger management and family trauma. It was a light sentence by most standards, but it was still an official acknowledgement that he had committed crimes and needed to be held accountable. More importantly, the conviction meant that Marcus would never be able to work in law enforcement, run for public office, or hold positions of trust over vulnerable populations. The golden child who had seemed destined for unlimited success would spend the rest of his life with the label of convicted abuser following him. During the impact statement portion of the hearing, I had the opportunity to address Marcus directly for the first time since the trial began. I had spent weeks preparing what I wanted to say, trying to find words that would capture the full scope of how his actions had affected my life. "Marcus," I said, looking directly at him as he sat at the defense table, "for 20 years, you made me believe that my pain didn't matter, that my voice didn't count, that I was too weak and too damaged to ever be taken seriously. You used your charm and your intelligence to convince everyone around us that you were incapable of cruelty, while systematically undermining my sense of reality and self-worth. He kept his eyes down during most of my statement, but I continued anyway. But you made one crucial mistake. You underestimated me. You thought that the scared little girl you pushed down those stairs would stay scared and silent forever. You never imagined that she would grow up to be someone with the courage and resources to hold you accountable. I paused, taking a breath before delivering the final part of my statement. I want you to know that I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because carrying anger and resentment was poisoning my own life. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean that your actions didn't have consequences. What it means is that I'm choosing to focus on my own healing and growth rather than on punishing you. When I finished speaking, the courtroom was completely quiet. Marcus finally looked up at me, and for just a moment, I saw something in his eyes that might have been genuine remorse. Whether it was authentic or just another performance, I would never know, but it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I had spoken my truth in the most official forum possible, and that truth had been heard and validated. After the sentencing, I drove back to my apartment and spent the evening cleaning and organizing, preparing for a new chapter of my life. The baby monitor that had started it all sat on my desk, no longer a symbol of childhood trauma, but a reminder of the power of preserved truth. I had decided to accept Sarah's offer to lead a new investigative series focused on delayed reporting of childhood abuse. It felt like a way to transform my personal experience into something that could help other survivors find their voices and seek justice. The series would launch in the fall, and I had already been contacted by dozens of potential sources who had been inspired by my story to come forward with their own experiences. It was work that would be emotionally challenging, but it was also work that felt meaningful in a way that transcended personal satisfaction. That evening, as I sat in my apartment, watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold and orange, I reflected on how far I had traveled from that scared 12-year-old lying at the bottom of our staircase. The journey had been longer and more difficult than I could have imagined, but it had led me to a place of strength and purpose that I never could have reached while staying silent. The baby monitor had done its job, preserving truth until the moment when that truth could finally be heard. And now, finally, after 20 years of waiting, justice had been served and healing could truly begin. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the dozens of messages I had received from other survivors, thanking me for my courage and asking for advice about their own situations. Each message was a reminder that my story was part of a larger narrative about speaking truth to power, about refusing to be silenced by shame or fear, about the possibility of healing even from the deepest wounds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight, for the first time in 20 years, I felt completely and utterly free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.